Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So in today's video I just want to talk about my favorite writing techniques, or some of my favorite writing techniques. This isn't an exhaustive list, it's just kind of the things that came to mind. I thought this would be kind of a fun thing to talk about and just talk about like stuff that I like doing in my work, stuff that I find fun to play around with. To be clear, this isn't meant to be a flex. Like, I'm not trying to say that I'm good at doing these things. These are things I aspire to do well or that I like implementing. I'm not necessarily trying to say that I'm good at all of them. I hope I am, but these are just fun things that I like to do. I'm also not trying to say that like these things are good writing and if you don't do them, it's bad writing. Cool, we're good with that? Let's just get started. My first writing technique that I love, I think there is a name for this, but I don't know what the name is, but it's verbing nouns. So basically like taking a noun and turning it into a verb, or just like making up a verb. Making up verbs like is, in my opinion, like one of life's greatest joys. There really is nothing like a good made up verb. It just really does stuff for me. Verbing nouns or making up verbs is so fun. Sure, sometimes I've gotten carried away, but it's such a delight. Like, this is basically where you take something that's not a verb and you just turn it into a verb. Like, one of my favorite verbs I ever made up was medusa'd. Like, I was talking about someone being like petrified and I was like, they could be medusa'd. You know, like just taking things that aren't verbs and making them into verbs. They don't have to be proper nouns. So the next two both relate to types of characters. It's not necessarily something I gravitate to all the time, but one thing I really like to do with characters is just to write about characters who want something that they know they shouldn't want. Obviously, characters having goals is great, and that's kind of like writing 101. But one thing I like to do a lot in my work is to have the character know on some level that they shouldn't want the thing that they want. I think that brings so much inherent conflict because the story is them pursuing what they want, but then they know they shouldn't want it. It just inherently adds a lot of conflict and tension to the situation, especially for short fiction. I think that this is a really cool technique to play around with, and it suits the style of story and character that I like to write about really well. Similarly to that, I really like writing about relationships that aren't what they're meant to be. So relationships that have an element of, like, there's just something surprising about them because the relationship isn't functioning how you'd think the relationship should function. This is the basis of a lot of the stories in my collection. If you've read my story, I Will Never Tell You This. It's a story about a language tutor and his student, but they act like father and daughter. So that's like a relationship that isn't what it's meant to be. In one of my stories that is forthcoming in the new quarterly, I don't know when that's going to be published, but it's called Hold Me Under Till I See the Light. It's one of my favorite stories I've ever written. I plan to expand it into a novel at some point. My goal with the main relationship in the story, the main character's name is Rainy, and they live in like a polygamous cult that she was raised in, and her sister is leaving, but her sister decides to get her a like replacement sister before she leaves. And my goal with the relationship between Rainy and her replacement sister Jude was for it to be kind of like all relationships at once. Like, it's fake sisterhood, but it's also kind of like mother-daughter, but like it's also romantic. It's kind of like for it to be like all relationships at once. So that's just something that I really enjoy doing in my work, is like having relationships that act like a different type of relationship than what they're supposed to be. Another writing technique that I really like is high realism or dreamy realism. So I talked about these things in my video on reality and fiction, but something that I really enjoy and isn't always intentional, I think it's just like the mood of my style a lot of the time, is to write in like high realism or dreamy realism. So it's realistic fiction. I'd still class it as realistic fiction. There's no magic or anything, it's not surreal, but it feels kind of dreamlike, or it feels kind of like beyond the point of intensity that like realism would be, or it's just like more strange. Everything's kind of either more heightened or more dreamlike, feels a little fantastical or feels a little surreal, even if it's not. This is something that I really love doing in a lot of my work. It's one of my favorite techniques. And even in, like, I've written a couple stories where there is a surreal element that comes in, like, at a certain point, but up until that point, having it be, like, kind of in that dreamy realism sphere. I'm really talking a lot with my hands in this one. Just trying to really showcase the realism. Because for me, as someone who loves, like, prose and atmosphere. That's something that you can play around with a lot on like the prose level, and like your imagery and choosing the right imagery and like careful word choice and even sentence structure. So that's a super fun one for me. So now we're gonna talk a little bit about point of view. I love point of view more than a person should love point of view. Like, it's point of view, Shaylin. Like, this isn't something that you should be so passionate about. But I really love point of view. And one of the point of views that I love is third person present tense. So, point a time where I was like, why? Like, what does that do? Like, what's the advantage of third person present tense? I didn't see any possible advantage to it. Oh, I was so wrong. I love third person present tense. I probably enjoy writing in third person present tense more than past tense. It's like one of my favorite point of views to write in. I find it so fun. To me, third person present tense has this really interesting, unique quality where you get the immediacy and like intimacy of present tense with this removal of third person. Not that third person is inherently distant, but it's like the story is so immediate because it's happening right now, but the character doesn't know that that there's an audience because it's third person, and so it almost, to me, feels like a lot of the time, third person present tense feels like you're reading a story you shouldn't be reading because the character like doesn't know. It's like, I'm here, but they don't know about it. And I think it can be like, it's almost like jarringly close. And then when it comes to first person, I love first person retrospective. One of my favorite writing techniques is writing in first person retrospective, which is first person past tense. There's like a conscious retrospective element, but the character is reflecting on the events. This is a point of view that I didn't use for a really long time, and then once I started using it, I was like, this is it. I found my soulmate, and it's first person retrospective. I love first person retrospective. I think it is really effective for a lot of the stories that I want to tell. It fits a lot of the stories that I want to tell really well. I've loved writing a novel in this point of view. My novel Honey Vinegar is first person retrospective, and I just find it to be a super fun one to use. And then another point of view that I love writing in is first person referral or first person directed. Everyone I know just makes up different names for this. I started calling it first person directed, and another friend of mine started calling it first person referral, and then I think I switched to first person referral. I don't even know what this is technically called or if we just made up these words. Sometimes I just say things and hope it sounds smart. I think I just discredited myself profoundly. What I'm saying is, I don't know where these terms came from, but you probably know the point of view I'm talking about. It's where it's in first person but one character is you. I love this point of view. My story I Will Never Tell You, this was also in this point of view. I haven't used it in a while. My novel is in this. What am I talking about? The novel I'm writing is in this, but it's different because the protagonist is the you. Rather, normally the protagonist would be the I and a side character is the you. But yeah, I love this point of view. I think it adds a really inherent tension to the narrative. It adds like a poignancy and a direction to the narrative because the narrative is now being told to a specific person. So there's like an agenda, there's a relationship, and it can make a really complex point of view because instead of the audience being the main character themselves or just kind of like a general unspecified audience, it's like a specific character, and so the whole point of view becomes an exploration of the relationship. And I just find that super neat and can cause a lot of tension. So the next thing that I love that's kind of hard to explain is atmospheric tension. I love atmosphere. Atmosphere is my jam because for me, I think I am a very like image atmosphere based writer. Most of my ideas start from an image and a feeling. They don't start from a concept. They start from this vague thing where it's like, I feel a certain vibe with this. What is it? I don't know. Hopefully eventually turns into a plot. When you have an atmosphere that's so well constructed and so immersive that it becomes a force of tension in the story. The prime example of this that I always think of is History of Wolves by Emily Fridland, probably my favorite book. That book is just so good, and part of why it's so good is because of the atmospheric tension. There are scenes where the character is just kind of like alone, not really doing anything, but because the atmosphere is so well constructed, there's this constant inherent tension. It's definitely something that I try to do in my work. I don't know if I always succeed. So my next point that I wrote down, I actually wrote in all caps because I guess it was so important. I said unhinged narrators. The word unhinged is my most overused word when it comes to describing my own writing. Everyone must be unhinged, or why am I here? Why are we wasting our time if they're socially well adjusted? I just like a bit of chaos, a bit of instability in my protagonists. I even like writing characters, especially in short fiction where I don't usually plan it, where I'm like, I don't really know what you're gonna do next. I don't really know what you're gonna say next. but that's why I'm here. This is fascinating to me. So for a couple more literary devicey techniques, the first thing that I love is just similes. And like a good simile. Really the only thing that rivals a good simile is a good verb. Similes are probably my most overused literary device, sometimes to the point that it's a crutch, definitely to the point that I have to edit a lot of them out of my work. To me, they're the most natural way to describe something. I don't really think about it. I just write and similes appear left, right, and center. There are so many of them. They just like multiply. I rarely consciously add a simile because I'm gonna have to cut most of them anyway because I overuse so many of them. Yes, I overuse them. Okay, I'll admit it. I will admit it. I overuse similes. I really like them. You know, I really like similes. I like them as a reader. I like them as a writer. I think they're fun if they're used well and they're surprising. It's just this delightful little burst of imagery that can be really unexpected and cool. The next literary technique that I really enjoy is anaphora, or just like any kind of repetition. I really like using repetition in my prose. I think it's really fun creating a repetitious sentence rhythm throughout a paragraph. I like to often use repetition as a way of structuring a paragraph, adding a kind of internal structure to an image. You know, typically you might think of as more of a poetic form, but I actually don't find myself gravitating towards repetition in poetry that often. It's actually in prose that I find myself really gravitating towards repetition. And then another literary technique that I really love is lists. I'm an unashamed list user. Just listing a bunch of qualities, listing a bunch of whatever. Lists as a form of description. There's nothing else I can say to elaborate. It's pretty straightforward. I just really like lists. And then another thing that I really like to do, I really like to think about color palette. Like, color is really important to me when I'm writing. Usually every single piece that I write has a color palette. Like I said, I often start from atmosphere, so there's always this clear color palette to the starting image, and I like to try to, as best as I can, imbue that throughout the entire piece. To the best of my ability, using color and trying to integrate that. I think it's partly why I describe the sky so much in my work. I want the sky to be like the right sky for my color palette. And then the final three techniques are kind of just like things I like to highlight or focus on in my descriptions, details that I like to come back to. The first one is I really like it when the world is kind of like, the world of the story is kind of like beautiful and disgusting simultaneously, you know? Like, sometimes I think writing style in a piece veers towards like making the world beautiful and picking up these beautiful details. And sometimes writing style in a piece, like say in like Otessa Moshfegh's work, she makes the world really disgusting. Like in Eileen, a lot of the details are so gross. And I kind of like to, a lot of the time, do both at the same time. Heighten the world to that sense of sensational beauty, but also like that kind of disgusting realism, and have them coexist, I think is really cool. It's not something that I do all the time because I think it needs the right piece to work, but that's something that I really like to do. I try to make writing pretty visceral, and I think highlighting like physical discomfort is something that I think I like doing a lot. Noting something that is uncomfortable physically, I think is something that I often like to do. I think it can be like jarring in a nice way, and it can be visceral. And then the last thing is I do like to have a lot of physicality, and especially like a lot of descriptions of anatomy and bodies. Like if there are multiple characters, I want them to interact physically. I think it's definitely a common mistake for the writer to kind of lose the character's body, and so for the character to not really be experiencing anything in like a physical way. That's something that I really never want to get lost in my work. I don't want them to lose like physical engagement with the setting of the world. I think that in a lot of ways that's like a really strong bridge point between narrator and reader. Like, it's one thing to just see something from the character's eyes, but it's another to feel something. So I'm always trying to have characters interact physically or be doing interesting actions with the world that really like enhances the physicality, and I think it's visually interesting too. Those are some writing techniques that I like. There are probably others, and it's not like I do this all the time. Every single thing that I write has all of these things, but these are just writing techniques that I like. Let me know what some of your favorite writing techniques are in the comments. I bet you guys are gonna think of a lot of really cool things, and I'm gonna be like, oh my god, yes, I forgot about that. I love that also. That's all I got for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.